Last week, I drove my Tesla Model 3 mid-range from Los Angeles, California to Phoenix, Arizona in order to attend my sister's wedding. As is customary in any wedding event, when you start small talk with family and friends, the conversation always trends to about how you got there and how long you were staying. Whenever I would mention that I drove an electric car from California into Arizona, the other person's eyes would widen up with this look of curiosity, and then the response would always be, "You drove your Tesla? How did you make it here? You must have made so many stops." To them, it was as if I successfully embarked on this dangerous Herculean journey and lived to tell the tale. After the first couple explanations about how it basically was the same journey as an ICE car, I quickly got annoyed, and I was like, I decided that I would need to make a video to address this subject when I got home. The majority of people who have range anxiety or reservations about the viability of EVs as cars are honestly the people who don't have EVs and are projecting their unknown fears. When I make it sound like it's no big deal, they think I must be understating the challenges of being an EV owner. So who has more viable knowledge on the subject? A guy who currently only drives and owns EVs? Or the non-EV driver who has heard it's impossible to drive a battery-powered car outside of their small town? One of the most commonly things that I get asked about my electric cars is why I would willingly choose to double the time it would take to make a trip with a Tesla when a gas-filled car can get me there much faster. Part of this stems from this preconceived idea many non-EV drivers have that charging stations are located in either a dark alley somewhere or a ditch way off of the freeway that you would have to navigate a maze to get to. The reality, though, is that at least with Tesla and the supercharging network, you'll end up in the same place as an ICE counterpart in about the same time, give or take. It's not that drastically different. In our 375-mile trip, Google estimated that it would take roughly 6+ hours to get there in a regular car. Leah and I caravanned with my parents, who made the trip with their dogs in a 2021 Mercedes GLS SUV. At this point in my Model 3's life, the original rated 264-mile battery has degraded to about 228 miles on 100% charge. That roughly equals 20 miles for every 10% of the battery. What I noticed for this specific trip was that my trip computer segmented the supercharging layout for about 2 hours of driving at a time. That makes perfect sense for this particular map from LA to Phoenix, as the desert has quite a few dead spots with nothing in sight for both EV and ICE drivers. On the way there, our first stop was at Cabazon, where we stopped to charge, albeit quite early, with about 50% of the battery drained. In hindsight, I would have skipped Cabazon and went a few stops down the line before stopping. However, already after about an hour and a half of driving in traffic, the dogs and my parents could use a breather, and the Cabazon outlet was a good place for them to actually get that.
Oh, all right. Well, we reached our first supercharging destination at Cabazon.
In about 15 minutes, the car was more than ready to go, but it took longer for us to trek back from the restrooms in that kind of linear layout of the outlets. If you've been to Cabazon, you know what I'm talking about. While also waiting for the dogs to do their business, that it did to get the car to charge at a point where it needed to get enough battery to make it to the next stop. Back onto the endless desert road for another 2+ hours, Lita and I actually had to stop one supercharger earlier than we had hoped.
Here is the light supercharger. Part of the Flying J, next to a Best Western.
Ironically, it was because our bladders were full and not that our full battery had drained to a critical point. We plugged and ran to the toilet and hit the road in 5 minutes with an extra 30 miles added on. I had called my parents before and told them to keep going to the next stop we had originally planned to meet at before Leah and I made our side trip. By the time we got to that stop, which was the Quartzsite supercharger, 30 minutes later, the Mercedes had just begun refueling at a gas station across the street. And all of a sudden, there's a bunch of Teslas. You know you're at a... Wow, look how many superchargers there are here.
There's like 30-something superchargers at this Quartzsite location.
It's a lot of superchargers here. Do it again.
My dog is okay?
Yeah, I think so. We had lunch at Carl's Jr. while the dogs had another potty break, and within 30 minutes, we had a near full charge for the last leg of the trip into Phoenix. Stopping every 2.5 hours to stretch and to urinate was something we all needed to do. Made it! Good job, good job. In fact, Lita and I actually got to the Airbnb before my parents did, because they actually ended up having to go gas up on the outskirts of Phoenix, as it was actually cheaper and my dad didn't want to go to inner Phoenix to do it. My dad was constantly worried about the Tesla running out of electricity and not being able to find a charger. But driving an ICE car on a trip in the desert still requires gauging your meter to make sure you refill before you run into a dead zone. We've all seen cars that run out of gas with no gas station in sight, stranded on the side of the freeway. It's all about responsibly planning your trip. Just because a car runs on gas doesn't mean you can run it down to near empty and expect a gas station to magically appear. The same applies for an EV. I can't speak on behalf of all the EV charging locations in the world, but at least with the dozens and dozens of various superchargers my Model 3 has come across, almost all of them have been located in safe and populated areas. I've always felt very safe in these areas. My father-in-law constantly has a fear of us using the superchargers, especially at nighttime. With the news reports that he sees about the Teslas being vandalized or drivers being robbed at gunpoint, it's easy to forget that statistically speaking, many more drivers get robbed at gas stations than at EV chargers, since there are way more gas stations in the world. Yeah. We are currently supercharging. This is what supercharging looks like. We have no idea.
I want to get out of the car, but I had to pee.
We have no idea where we are, but we needed to charge the car, and we just followed where the supercharger is, and we somehow ended up in a place like this.
It's very nice.
In the middle of the night with a bunch of people just hanging out, and it's pretty cool. There's like some really fancy stores. I guess Scottsdale is full of things like this. So that's what supercharging does. It takes you to places that you weren't going to go to originally, and a lot of people seem to think supercharging takes you to like black alleys, dark alleys, sketchy neighborhoods. Look at that freaking Apple store. Holy. Look at that. That's a giant Apple store. That's a really fancy Apple store. But yeah, so that's one of the benefits of supercharging. It's not dark alleys. They put it in some really nice places sometimes. Tesla specifically has done a terrific job strategically placing the chargers in convenient and desirable locations. Range anxiety is a real mental issue. However, it just isn't a big one for most EV drivers. As with the double the trouble situation we talked about just before, it seems range anxiety really just occupies the thinking space of people who don't even have electric vehicles. In everyday commutes, many of us don't even consider how much charge we have left when driving, because we all know when we get home, the car will be ready to go the next morning. There isn't a need to go out of your way to fill up your car with 30% left, 40% left. The car is just ready to go. It's a different lifestyle and mindset that ICE drivers have a hard time processing without actually experiencing it. I don't blame them. The way I try to explain it to the dozens of people who ask me monthly about how I cope with driving an EV is for them to look at it as if this was 2012. Let me try to explain, because smartphones were becoming a thing in 2012, yet many of the older generation of people were extremely reluctant to part with their flip phones and Blackberries. It took me half of a year to convince my parents to finally upgrade their ancient tech to a Galaxy S and a Galaxy Note. Many of the reservations they had sounded eerily similar to why my dad currently doesn't want to buy an EV, even though, he constantly talks about doing it often. Here are some of the things that he would constantly bring up back in 2012. Charging is so inconvenient. Why do I need to charge every day when my phone right now can last a week? Yes, we charge our phones every day now, but it has become a normal part of life that people don't complain about anymore because the benefits of a smartphone significantly outweigh the inconvenience of not having all-week battery life. My dad definitely doesn't mention how inconvenient it is charging his phone every single night anymore. Why do I need all this stuff on my phone? I can check my emails and go on the internet on my computer when I get home. Yes, we don't technically need all the bells and whistles we get on a Tesla, but when is having flexibility a bad thing? Email everywhere and anywhere has revolutionized how the world works. The same can be applied to Teslas. No one technically needs dog mode or sentry mode right now, but if you've used it in your daily routine, you'll never be able to go back to a car that doesn't have it without feeling like you've reverted back to the Stone Ages. And my favorite one is, I don't like not having physical buttons. It's inconvenient having to press everything on just a screen. So many people had to adjust to what we now call swiping instead of having a physical numpad and arrow keys to work with. Apparently, EVs are notoriously linked with big touchscreens and less physical buttons. So that's another reason why some buyers can never consider buying them. Even a lot of car reviewers constantly view this as a negative aspect of EVs. I don't know about you, but I don't think I can readjust back to using a physical numpad or a non-smartphone as my daily driver ever again. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I find having all the controls on one big screen perfectly acceptable to the driving experience of a Tesla. Look, whether you agree with me or not, the point is, a lot of the fears and resistance to change is based on the notion that new is bad. I saw the same types of concerns when the world switched from dumb phones to smartphones. For those of us who have already made the switch to the electric vehicle realm, many of those fears have already been left behind. Yes, there will be times as an EV driver where the fear of not making it to a charging station will cross your mind, but that should also be the case for an ICE driver with gas. It's called being responsible and not letting your car die. You're anticipating and preparing to safely get to where you need to go. Why is this a bad thing? Why is this mindset bad? I don't understand that. In my early college days, I saw so many of my friends neglect their warning signs of the whole dreaded empty fill gauge and waited until the last minute, the absolute last minute, to find a gas station to fill up on trips. It drove me crazy when my ex-girlfriend did that. Some of them didn't make it. Walking to the nearest gas station is such a walk of shame. Yes, the infrastructure isn't as developed as gas stations for EVs. How could it possibly be with a 100+ year head start for ICE cars? At least with Tesla, I can honestly say that for most routes to populated metropolitan areas, it's already a viable infrastructure. If you're waiting for it to be as mapped out as gas stations are, then you gotta wait another 109 years. Getting to a destination, filling up a car, whether it be electricity or gasoline, requires sensible management, and that's on the driver, not the car.
The only thing better than a Tesla stock is subscribing. Are these cute to use?